My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. On today's episode, I talked to Justice. A couple of the topics that are covered are curating your group, and then some really fun tips on world building and describing visuals. Don't forget, we do have a design contest going on until the end of January. All you have to do is use one of the Google forms in the show notes /description and submit a item idea that is 250 words or less, and you'll be entered in for the first place and second place prize. And those winners will be announced around a week after this competition ends at the end of January. So you've still got some time. Think about an item that would fit in a fantasy desert metropolis and go ahead and throw your submissions out there. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Justice with me. Welcome, Justice.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Justic Geddes. I'm a writer and narrative designer. I recently worked for Wizards of the Coast, working on Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. I've been running Dungeons and Dragons for like a decade. I write LARPs. I've played all sorts of role-playing games, taught probably 150 players how to play D&D, from professors to 6-year-olds. Stoners and seniors alike, a wide variety of books. So,
That's awesome. How did you get started initially in the hobby?
well, I was about 11, and kids were playing at my middle school, and I was jealous because I thought they were much cooler than me. So I got a little boxed set from the local college bookstore, and I started playing with myself. Was both DM and all of the players in my bedroom in the basement of my parents' house.
So you started out in the solo RPG space just from the get-go.
That's true facts. Yeah, I mean it was D&D, not intended for that. It was 4th edition at the time. Um, but that's what I did for a while. Then I made my little siblings play with me, expanded out into all sorts of plots from there.
Yeah, that is kind of the classic, right? That's kind of how I got started too, is I wanted to get into it and then was like, well, I don't have anybody else to play with, so sister and girlfriend at the time, you guys are playing a game with me, so
That's what's up. Yep. I say that my little sister is the best Dungeons and Dragons player I've ever met because she has been playing for a decade just as I've been DMing for a decade. So she's got a lot of practice.
That's awesome. Are there specific things that you've picked up as a dungeon master, kind of as you've been running games for the last decade or so?
Definitely, yeah. I have taken a very freeform approach where I have run published adventures, I've run homebrew adventures, I've just tried to learn from all of the many players that I've run games for, and learn to cater to specific interests. Lots of variety, but definitely some things that you know continue that occur in all of my different adventures. I have found it more and more important to highlight diversity, highlight characters and stories of different identities in my plots, and I found it more and more interesting to engage with the specific identities and experiences of my players. Write the stories that they want to experience, that they want to have in the foregrounds of their minds, and write those into my plots. But I also have learned some very classic D&D things. I am a big advocate of the deeply strategic villain who you play just as strategically as a player plays their PC, among other things.
When you're trying to pull what your players kind of want to see in both their characters and the story, is that a conversation that you have just with them about what they want, or how do you kind of pull that information out of them?
Yeah, of course I have session zeros, like most people who run games nowadays, where we talk through the kind of game that we want to be playing, what we want our characters to look like, But I try to curate my play groups even before the session zero, where I'm very, very intentionally selecting the people that I want to be playing with. I think you'll have a far more successful adventure if you are playing with a group of people who want to be playing with each other and who have shared interests, and a diversity of experiences that they can bring to the table. So being very intentional about who I choose to play in my plots, and talking to them, yeah, a lot beforehand about trying to make sure that I know them really well, understand who they are, what they're going to bring. That means making sure that I am not running tables where we have five cis white guys who are going to play in a certain way, but making sure that I have diverse tables, people of different gendered experiences, different race and ethnicity experiences, all sorts of different things, making sure that any table that I'm going to run a game at is going to be a healthy, positive place for all involved. So there's been times, right, when I've been running multiple plots at once. And for example, in college, I was the head of a gaming club and I coordinated probably 12 weekly adventures, of which I ran 5 or 6 of them. So I would run an adventure every weekday evening. And I selected people signed up, said they wanted to play, and then I distribute them out into different groups. And that meant that I got to choose groups that I knew these kids wanted to play in a high combat adventure, and these kids were more interested in the role playing and having their little romances on the side of the plot, things like that. And being able to split up people based on what their interests are, what kind of things they'll actually enjoy, and also their personalities. Some people don't get along and they shouldn't play role playing games together. That's just a fact. So, yeah.
Well, it's cool that like in college you had that experience where you could kind of curate those groups because I mean you make a point if there are people in a group that just don't mesh well with people or they're not trying to get the same thing out of the game as somebody else, then those groups or those sessions wouldn't end very well. I feel like, or like campaign wise.
Right. Someone won't be having fun. And I think the Dungeon Master's goal frequently is to help your players and yourself have fun when you can. And you're just setting yourself up to fail in that case.
Um, did you find? So it sounds like you have a pretty wide array of like types of games that you've run.
That's true.
Then,
Yes.
right? So with your like diverse experience in running games for people, um, do you find there are certain things that tend to be common across all of the groups, even though you have very diverse kind of interests in the game?
To be honest, I don't think that any plot that I've run has been just the same as another. I have one homebrew plot that I'm very proud of that I constructed as a learn to play adventure for new players because I've taught so many new players how to play, and it's a plot that I've run probably 7 times, with a different play group every single time, fully homebrew, and each experience has looked entirely different. Each experience has focused on different things. The homebrew settings and plots that I create are designed so that the players have most of the agency, really, in what directions the plot goes, what kind of things we focus on. Of course, we're going to have combat, we're going to have exploration, we're going to have role playing. The basics of Dungeons and Dragons are universal to whichever game I'm going to be running, but I try very, very hard to make them as distinct as possible and cater to the specific interests of players.
And how do you go about planning a homebrew setting like that or story where you can allow the players to be, vastly different in the way they play through
Yeah. This is a complicated question. There's a lot of pieces,
it?
of course. But I can walk you through my world building process a little bit. I frequently start with the barest bones of an idea. There's this little chunk in one of my homebrew settings where I was like, wouldn't it be cool if all of the trees in the forest had souls and their souls were literal flames that lived inside the trees. And it's like, wow, and they're lantern trunks or whatever. I thought it was such a cute idea. And I just started coming up with you start with just the barest bones of an idea, and then ask yourself questions over and over and over again about the idea. Nitpick at it. You know, okay, um, what do people do with the bark of these trees? Do the trees talk, and who do they talk to? Who lives with the trees? Ask yourself questions about the logistics of the world, of the idea, the people that are connected to the idea, and in writing down all of these answers, in to create more and more of an outline of the environment. Frequently, this leads me to come up with a location, an area, and then to populate it. If I have an idea for a town, then I have to come up with, well, this town needs all of these different sorts of people, and it also needs all of these different sorts of possibilities for different kinds of players. I have to make sure that there are combat encounters built into the location, built into the idea. I have to make sure that there are a multitude of role playing opportunities for players who are seeking different things. There need to be um, people that you're going to argue with. There need to be people that you're going to ally with. There need to be all sorts of different types of characters to appeal to whatever player is going to do in that area. I think that some people who run games struggle because they set themselves too small of a starting idea or a location. They say, okay, here's my village of just 50 people or whatever, and here are the 4 NPCs that I've come up with for them to interact with in this town. And they limit the possibilities for their players by choosing this location that's simply too small to actually function. I always recommend to people put more big cities in your worlds and put more huge swaths of farm area where you can cross and meet all sorts of types of people. Just keep asking questions that expand the environments that you're creating. Yeah, that's it.
Um, yeah, and that makes sense. Just kind of taking like a logical approach to it. Like, well, if this is the case, then what does that mean for like you mentioned the bark and what would people do with the bark, and kind of growing from there. When you are prepping like NPCs and stuff, are you just writing down like tons and tons of just different like people that they can interact with and kind of like how they're connected to the location, or is that a lot of that kind of done on the fly for you? What does that look like?
I prep quite a bit. The yeah, I think that actually among my players and fellow DMs, I have a reputation for prepping way more possibilities than the players will ever actually encounter. But that I think that really sets my homebrew up for success. I don't mind doing the over prep, and I don't find it to be particularly time consuming after I've been running Dungeons and Dragons for this long. I can come up with an idea for a character and throw it into a Google Doc or whatever pretty quickly. I make an absurd number of just lists of names, and then I will go back to the list of names. I'll like think about it another time when I don't have the list in front of me, and I'll attempt to just write out all of the list of names that I wrote down before. And as I read the names over and over again, I try and write them out. The ones that stick, the ones that I can remember every time that I come back to it, those are the ones that I know I'm going to use, and those are the characters that get fleshed out the most. If something sticks in my head, it must be good. So then I will write more about it, or once it's stuck in my head, I'll be like, oh, and here's a couple new details about this. So that the next time I come around to the list, I'm like, oh, that's right. This woman that I named Alicia or whatever, she has twin braids and this cool halberd, and she's the guard or whatever of the lighthouse or something. I start coming up with these little pieces of an idea, and then every time I come back to the character, there's more to her.
And are these just kind of like small entries then, where it's just like a couple of sentences, or like how detailed do you get with these?
It depends on what I'm expecting. Oftentimes, when I come up with a character, I have a pretty good idea of how significant the character's interaction with the players is going to be. If they're not that important, you don't need to flesh them out that much. Yeah, if you are just coming up with a silhouette for the guard who's outside the lighthouse, you probably don't need a whole worksheet or whatever. And I'll be honest, there's no characters that I write multiple pages on or whatever. I come up with my characters, I think about them repeatedly, and eventually the things that I've come up with just get stuck in my head. And the things that I remember are what becomes actually true about them. The things that I wrote down one time and then forgot about, they're not going to be in the plot.
Sure, it's just kind of what is top of mind for you, really.
I think that I'm lucky to have the type of brain that will pull the pieces of information out that my players are looking for. A player expresses interest in something, and then the idea that I had 3 months ago for an NPC in this town that might be relevant is the thing that comes to mind, and I'm able to work them in.
Well, that's a handy skill to have.
I guess. I think
um,
I think something that's okay, this is a tangent, but it's fine. I think what's like super key for me for having those like pieces of a character that get stuck in my memory is the same thing that it's something that I try to have be true about my ideas so that they also stick in the heads of my players. And frequently that means the visuals of an idea are the most important. If I can successfully describe a visual that's going to get stuck in someone's head, it's also something that's going to get stuck in my head. Um, it's this like idea of creating images that will stick, an image of a character or of a location. The job that I worked for Wizards of the Coast, I was a visual writer. I basically wrote concepts for characters and for locations and things that would then get turned into art by artists. So my job was to make something
okay.
as easy to understand in a visual manner. It's basically commissioning, right, as a job, where I needed to be able to have the words that would make the visual that I wanted comprehensible to someone who might speak a different language, to anyone who might read it. They would exactly know exactly what I'm saying in the smallest number of words possible. And I think that that's a crucial skill for a dungeon master. You do your scene setting speech. If it takes a full 2 minutes, the party is going to forget about the little details that you said. You need to be able to get across the key details about the environment or the character that you're describing in a very short amount of time. You need to create an image right away that's going to stick in someone's head. For me, that means frequently focusing on the character's silhouette. Like I was describing that guard off the top of my head just a second ago. Like twin braids, halberd, these like hair is a visual that will stick out to people a lot of the times. If you imagine like the lighthouse, you can like be like, okay, and she's standing in the lighthouse, the light coming off behind her, and we see the silhouette of her braids and her halberd, and like you create that image really quickly, then that will stick in someone's head. So you need these distinct shapes of hair, of like capes and cloaks, of distinct weapon shapes like a halberd. There's all sorts of good ones, but really distinct images that will get in your head crisply are really important to get something across to a player quickly as well.
That's awesome. I was going to ask you if you had tips, but you really kind of summed it up with having just specific shapes and everything. I just
Nice.
listening to you describe that was actually very vivid for me too. Just I could picture everything that you were saying. That's a really cool experience that you had, being able to work for Wizards, and then especially doing that, like you said, is a very important DM skill,
Yeah.
just in and of itself. So getting a chance to just kind of hone that a little bit in like a professional setting was probably pretty cool.
Yeah, and definitely helpful for running games.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your time with Wizards?
I can speak to it a little bit. I have a lot of stuff that is under NDA because they work really far in advance, so I can't talk a lot of details about things that are coming out. Um, But one thing that is cool is I'm really proud of the creative work that I did on a set that's upcoming in a few months, which is Commander Legends: Battle for Baldur's Gate. It's a Magic the Gathering set that is Dungeons and Dragons themed and set in and around the city of Baldur's Gate in the Forgotten Realms. So I'm pretty excited about that. I concepted bajillion characters and locations and stuff. And that card set will get spoiled here pretty soon. So that should be really exciting. It was very cool to work with the established lore of D&D and the lore of Magic the Gathering. Work those together and imagine the iconic images of D&D in sort of a fresh context. So some of the stuff for D&D, even from 5th edition, is a few years old now, and it doesn't feel quite as relevant today. So it's great being able to work on making more images to depict that world that all of us who play D&D know so well in a fresh way.
That's really cool. And I always think that using like Magic the Gathering cards or something is a good way almost to use them as like a random table. Like if you need a monster, like,
Sure.
throw a bunch of magic cards out, and you can even make like little sets like, oh, your characters are going through the forest, we'll get a bunch of green cards and throw them together and you have,
Cute.
encounters basically, right?
Yeah.
So um, to see more of a direct crossover with like D&D stuff would be really cool.
Yeah. I think people really enjoyed AFR, The Adventures of the Forgotten Realms Magic set that came out, and I think that Baldur's Gate will feel like a really nice follow-up. Also, you can know that it was worked on. The creative was done by someone with an immense amount of knowledge about Forgotten Realms, Baldur's Gate specifically, and Dungeons and Dragons. So definitely a lot of love poured into it by me.
Are there other topics in just in like dungeon mastering in general that you're like really passionate about or would like to talk to people about?
My brain is like really on my making cool visuals thing. So you might just get more about that. But
No, that's perfect because I don't think we've actually had a lot about visuals specifically. So any like tips or anything you can give that would help listeners figure out how to be better at doing that? I know that's something that I sometimes struggle with as well, is just being able to draw that picture in other people's minds.
yeah. I grew up as a whiteboard DM where all of the little maps that I made and when I needed to draw a monster or whatever, I would scribble it out on a whiteboard. Um, I played D&D when I was growing up, like in the public library or in classrooms or in the basement at my church or whatever, all sorts of weird places. But the constant theme was whiteboards. So I got very used to drawing those. But since COVID-19 especially, I haven't been able to do that, right? Drawing on a whiteboard and presenting it on a screen is very difficult. So I think I'm relying even more on my ability to describe things to people when I'm playing games over Discord or Zoom equivalents or whatever. Um, but one of the things that has really helped me I talked a little bit about like characters and the viz of characters, how to make them stick in people's heads. Um, I think something that people struggle with a lot is the visuals of their locations and their set pieces. If you have this cool idea for a location you want a combat encounter to take place at, but you can't convey to your players what that location looks like, you're going to end up confused the entire combat. Players will be like, wait, where am I? Where are the monsters? How do I get up there? That happens all the time to people I've seen. Um, so being able to very specifically describe what your environment actually looks like is crucial. I absolutely recommend people watch a YouTube video on how to draw 3D. Basically, my tip is going to be three-dimensionality. Three-dimensionality is the number one way to make your locations visually comprehensible. if you're describing a location, and it also makes it more exciting. Yeah. But if you're describing a location and you are talking about the if you're describing this big flat area and you're like, here's where the woods are and here's where the rocks are or whatever, it's harder to landmark it. But if you put things above other things, below other things, you create falling hazards for your players, which is lots of fun. But also, you can separate the area that you're talking about in a lot more clear way. If you say, okay, down here in the middle of the canyon, we have a few rocks, and here's where some kobolds are. And then up on your right, you can see a platform that someone's constructed out of wood that's about 40 feet above you, built into the side of the canyon, and you can see some archers up there. And then you can see even higher up, 80 feet, the top of the canyon, where water is spilling down in from above and causing rain to fall on the kobolds, on the archers, and on you. You know, creating these different levels helps the players understand the visual of the location you're describing a lot more clearly, in my experience. You're able to lay out exactly where things are in a way that's more understandable. I think it's because people understand height better than we understand distance. When you say someone is 900 feet away, that doesn't mean very much. But when you say someone is the height of a small house above you, um, that means a lot more.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you said, just like a big open field. I mean, even if you tell them measurements and stuff, it's really easy to just forget what that is. But like you said, you kind of broke up that last example into like almost zones
Yeah,
almost.
yeah, yeah.
And then it doesn't really matter where they're at because they're just separate. They're all separate zones that can somewhat interact with each other.
Right, exactly. You don't have to have the specific measurements worked out every time, as long as, and I'm totally willing to fudge what a player's speed is or whatever if they're trying to get somewhere. It's like what makes sense for you to be able to get to matters way more to me than the actual distance or whatever. If I'm trying to be rude to a player or restrict them from having too much influence on a scene, that's the only time that I'll be like, "What is your speed?" Um, Otherwise, it's more fun if players can accomplish what they want to accomplish, get where they want to be, and height does a lot more work to differentiate the difficulty of getting to different places than pure lateral distance does.
And when you're playing, are you mostly playing Theater of the Mind then?
Um, yeah, I will. Well, certainly nowadays, yes. I don't use miniatures. I haven't used miniatures since fourth edition. As soon as 5e came out, those all went in the box. I didn't have very many, but um, I find that constricting people's experience of the game to a war game where you have to measure out exactly how far you're moving and check your angles of who you can see, prevents players from feeling, yeah, like they are actually within the experience. They worry too much about the mechanics of moving around and lining up their cone for their burning hands. Where I'm just going to tell you, your cone of burning hands can hit 5 kobolds or whatever, 5 of the 8. I don't care, and I'll make up the things that I need to make up in the moment, in order for the players to understand the situation. And I'm always willing to let them do a little bit more than might necessarily be allowed by the rules, because I want them to succeed.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, I think I tend to rely on maps a little bit to uh, take the burden off of me for having to describe and redescribe a scene multiple times, and to some
Yeah.
degree, just having to remember what it looks like. Like where am I at again? Well, let me think. Okay, you were about here, so this is what you can see from there. So in that regard, having a map is nice, but Also, I would say that I probably don't have, a good amount of skills in that visual description, as you've mentioned. Um, so getting better at some of those things, I think, would help me to run Theater of the Mind just a little bit better.
I I absolutely can't recommend it enough. The more I'm able to detach the story that I'm telling from technical pieces and technical maneuvering, the more it feels like a story and less like a game. And I think that the storytelling, even of combat, is more powerful than the numbers and words on the papers that we for Dungeons and Dragons.
And are you? You said you were running fifth edition, right?
I currently run 5e. Yeah, I have run Dungeons and Dragons of every edition. I have a little stash of very early first edition books that are from my dad's college best friend. So I've run every edition of D&D, and I prefer 5th edition. I prefer the newest edition, partially because I think it enables Theater of the Mind gaming the best.
Sure. Have you branched out at all into any of the like non D&D role playing games at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I've played Pathfinder. I really like horror games, so I run a lot of Dread, Final Girl, stuff like that. I've been playing a lot of Dialect recently, which is an RPG adjacent language and community building game. I really like to try out whatever I can, but it's definitely true that I come back to 5th edition as the classic, the original that I'm most familiar with, and love to teach and play.
Well, you can always steal stuff from the other games and bring them back to D&D, so that's not usually a problem. What advice do you have for new dungeon masters?
Yeah. Actually, I used to run a DM's workshop for new DMs where we would get someone's intro to their plot. Basically how it was run was people would sign up and they would prepare either a one shot or the beginning of a longer plot. And we would have them run like what would be the first session of their longer plot as a one shot. And it was me and a couple of other DMs would meet with them a couple of times in advance and workshop the content that they had prepared for their one shot or for their plot. And then we would gather players for them to be able to test it out. And then I would sit in and play in a lot of those. I worked a lot with one player who kept coming back, who was always a little too afraid to run his own plot and kept coming back to our workshops to sort of retry out the beginning of his adventure, which meant that I played it several times. Um, and it needed workshopping. He got lots of feedback. The kind of feedback that we gave varied a lot, but the feedback I gave often focused on, okay, here are the NPCs that you have provided in your one shot or in your starting area. How do we make them more interesting and memorable? Why have you selected the identities and like careers or the classes of the NPCs that you've chosen? And what can we do to make them more memorable? We turned for that guy's plot. We turned one just like group of farmers that were supposed to be the people you were supposed to help. We made them into giant sentient hermit crabs instead, who had a hard time moving around and needed help instead because they were too slow and big. And it was just like finding the new weird takes on things to make the plots that you're coming up with more memorable. So that was good. But we also talked a lot about being able to manage your players and manage your table because we had a lot of DMs come in who were quite introverted, which I think is the case with many people who want to DM and people who play Dungeons and Dragons, that have anxiety about, controlling and managing a group of people, controlling the environment and being able to talk over people when necessary, those sorts of things can be really difficult. And so we talked about specific strategies that you can take to shut someone down who is taking over, taking too much space at the table. There was a couple of players who would show up who were wanting to help, but would make a character that was so out there or so wild, and we told the new DMs, you're the DM in this context, and you have the agency to tell someone that this character that they've brought or that they want to play isn't a fit for the plot that you're going to run. It's important that you be able to, even for just a one shot or whatever, even if you're playing with people who you haven't met before, you need to be able to set guidelines for yourself that are going to, and for your plot, that are going to make you feel comfortable and like you're able to actually have the story that you want to have. And that means not necessarily allowing the Aarakocra artificer with the homebrew subclass, and who only talks in bizarre, distracting accent. Having our like funny meme characters is something people like to do for one shots and one offs, but it doesn't lend itself to people being able to actually learn or enjoy the game. I guess this is coming back to the curate your playgroup, but it also means curate the characters that you allow people in your playgroup to play. You actually do need to set guidelines about what's allowed. Like, I am super invested in my three-dimensional combats places and things. That means that I don't allow characters at first level who can fly at first level, because I want, in the early part of an adventure, the falling damage to feel like a real threat. They have to find ways to fly or climb or whatever, that aren't just built into their species or what have you at the start of the game. So, the important piece of advice for new players: don't be intimidated by your players who've been playing for a long time. You are the person running the game as the DM, and you should claim agency over the story that you want to create. Absolutely work with your players, but don't let them talk over you. Don't let them decide things for you. Believe in yourself. And if that means sometimes you need to duck behind your DM screen and like take a breath and resituate yourself, remind yourself that you're in charge.
Yeah, remembering that you're in charge is definitely some good advice because, especially as a DM, is oftentimes you want to enable your players to play the things that they want, but sometimes they don't work very well.
Yeah. Uh, you get to set guidelines. You get to set your home rules. Even if you've never DM'd before, I think you don't have to be confined to, here's what's in all of the books. Here's the rules that Wizards of the Coast. I know I worked for WotC, and so it's like blasphemous to say that you don't have to follow all of the WotC rules, but but you really don't. Even when you're new, having your own things that you say and you set helps you feel like it's your game, and that's what it should be.
Is there a channel or Twitter or somewhere that we can find you or that you would like to promote?
Sure. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Justice Jameson. Justice Justice, Jameson Jameson. That's my Twitter. I'm also on TikTok, Instagram, a few other places. I've got a youthful spirit. I'm on the social media. I also stream occasionally on Twitch at Urchin Advocist. So you can look me up there too if you like.
Awesome. And I'm gonna ask you one more question before we
Great.
wrap up
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
If you could have any RPG book created, what would you put in it?
yeah. Well, I have talked about for years and years writing my own and putting my homebrew setting into a book. And I think I'm gonna do it. I've been working on it for years, so eventually I'll finish and I'll decide it's done and publish it on something. So of course that's what's close to my heart. That's what I'd answer. But a wider answer, not just drawing from my own things. I think that Dungeons and Dragons, especially, is in desperate need of stories made by Asian and Asian American creators who foreground their experiences and backgrounds in ways that are not Orientalist and offensive. I think we've suffered from that for years as a gaming community. And I know that there are people doing that work, and I wish that WotC would pick one of them up and turn it into an official product.
I think I saw a Twitter post or something like a couple days ago that was saying that they really should have more like the monk is like the only kind of like Eastern like kind of class, right? But there's a lot of things that people could pull from those cultures and stuff that we just don't really currently see. I was like, yeah, I mean, it is kind of lacking, and it would be really cool to see more, classes and locations and stuff that are based on some of those cultural things that we just maybe haven't gotten to see yet.
I think there's amazing potential for people in the community right now who could do that in a very authentic, genuine way. And I wish we would give them more attention.
Awesome. Well, Justice, I had an awesome time talking to you.
Thank you. You too, bro.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.